afternoon, everyone. My name is Carmen Ramirez, and I will be the moderator for you today. On behalf of the Forum of Intercultural Leadership and Learning, or PHIL, a reference group of the Canadian Churches Council, welcome to this webinar, Deeper Understanding of Interculturality, Living, Learning, and Relating Interculturally in Canadian Contexts. Why are we here today? Well, several years ago, PHIL had held a broad consultation with stakeholders and intercultural practitioners across Canada. Two clear needs emerged from that consultation: elaborated theologies of intercultural ministry shaped out of the Canadian context, and two, a specific way to articulate this theology. PHIL then formed a research and theology group, and you will be able to meet some of the members of this group today. They created an invitation to dialogue and conversation and have conversation. And for our conversation today, we will use this proposed intercultural framework and guiding principles. So what we will do right now is we will give them an opportunity. What we're going to do right now is look over what we will be doing for this particular gathering today. And the program is Emo Yango and Lloyd Nayarota will introduce the document. We will hear a response to the document from Kim Uedikai and Chun Yang. Together, we will have some conversation on the document, and then you will spend some time in small group conversations. We will close with some time to hear from the groups, some question and answer time, and the closing remarks from Nestor Medina. And at this time, we can hear from each of the presenters as they present themselves.
Okay, my name is Lloyd Nyarota. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, currently in Northern Alberta, where I'm an admission candidate in the United Church of Canada and serving at the St. John's United Anglican Church, which is a shared ministry in Northern Alberta. Thank you.
Apologies, Carmen. Name is Emo Yango. I work at the General Counsel Office of the United Church of Canada. I'm a network coordinator there. One of the things that I oversee is the racial justice program, as well as the interculturality, intersectionality analysis part of the work that we do. I'm originally from the Philippines and migrated here when I was way back. I don't want to date myself, but I'm happy to be here and engage with everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. My name is Kim Uedikai. My Japanese name is Harumi, which means spring sea. I was born and raised and still live in Toronto. I serve as Regional Council staff person of the United Church of Canada, and I support communities of faith, right relations, and anti-racism. I am a co-chair of CERN, the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network, and because of that, I sit on PHIL as the CERN rep. Thank you.
Okay, so my name that I was given during immigration was Joan, so some of you know me as that. My Chinese name is Lam Zhongyan, last name comes first, and it means praising God's grace, and it was given to me by my parents. And I am an immigrant with my family from Hong Kong, originally back in the 80s. I'm going to date myself, Emo. And then I am now a Lutheran pastor, serving at an Anglican parish in Ottawa East, Blackburn, Bearbrook, and Navan. And so this highlights our full communion relationship between the Lutherans and the Anglicans. And I feel very much at home with all of you United Church folks.
All right, me too. Hi, everybody. My name is Nestor Medina, and I am a member of the theology group of PHIL. And I also am an assistant professor at Emmanuel College, assistant professor of religious culture and religious ethics and culture.
And thank you all for presenting yourselves. So we will go ahead with the presentations now, and I believe Lloyd will be the first presenter. And Lloyd, you have 10 minutes, and you can go ahead.
Thank you, Carlos. I am going to present the first part of this document, which which we are calling all of you to engage in the conversation as we try to work on this. So the document is on interculturality, and it is a framework and guiding principles. So what we are presenting here are the framework and guiding principles, and also it is an invitation for conversation and dialogue. So we are inviting all of you to this conversation and to engage in this dialogue. So the Forum for the Intercultural Leadership and Learning is a reference group of the Canadian Council of Churches. So now we worked on this as the theology group and decided to present it to you. Phil offers this living document as a framework and guiding principles as it attempts to be open to, as we attempt to be open to and live out interculturality in our various church communities. Phil recognizes that interculturality is a complex and painstaking process of mutual learning and of undoing inherited structures that privilege a small segment of society over others. As a living document, this will change over time as we become more sensitive to hearing God's calling to become a prophetic community. Phil offers this document as an invitation to conversation and dialogue. So we are all invited to this conversation and to this dialogue to engage together. The Phil Theology and Research Working Group has adopted the framework and guiding principles. And these are: one, the celebration and welcoming of diverse voices of faith communities to be part of the conversation, with the recognition that each of us speak from different ethno-cultural vantage points. We recognize we all come from different cultural and ethno-cultural vantage points. Diverse, according to this, diverse here denotes inclusion of all varying expressions of the human experience, including but not limited to ethno-racial, cultural, religious traditions, age, gender, sexual orientation and identity. Also includes class, ableness, citizenship, also includes education, geographic location, and the list can go on and on, as inclusive and as diverse as we can be. Number two is to acknowledge that each of us encounters each other with our own unique experiences and ways of knowing and diverse spiritual and theological traditions. There are so much diverse spiritual traditions and so much diverse theological tradition, but we say we acknowledge and we encounter each other from that broader spectrum. We intend to integrate the available language and to develop and create new language to speak about intercultural exchanges. Intercultural exchanges are the multi-level dynamics by which members of different ethno-cultural communities interact with each other and draw from their own sources of knowledge and wisdom to make sense of life, interact with each other the environment and make sense of the divine cultural traditions are not understood here as finished products or as uniform. They are conceived as porous and dynamic and in constant process of fluctuation or constant process of change. So this is how we are inviting all of us to engage into this conversation and dialogue. And I'll leave this time to my co-presenter, Emma, to pick from there.
And thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, Carmen, as well. So as we continue with the invite to converse and dialogue here, I want to add that part of our objective, and Jonathan, if you can just start the other, yeah, thank you. Part of our objective here is committed to reflect on the meaning of interculturality. So the question now is, how do we do this? Please keep in mind that these are guiding principles to help us frame a definition for interculturality within our specific context. So the first one is, hold on. By naming and challenging the duality between theory and practice in Western Eurocentric context and validating and affirming the holistic nature of life, and in that sense, what we want to communicate is that we don't necessarily have to understand interculturality as monolithic, as if there is just one single meaning to interculturality. There are different communities, and different communities understand the term differently. We need to guard also against duality and name duality as a disconnecting power. In Western Eurocentric context, the tendency is to separate our experiences of life into disconnected pieces without necessarily bringing all the pieces together at the end. So one example is we think, we feel, we do, we intuit, and all of these are separated from each other. Another example is that we separate the private and the public, and in these cases, life is reduced to all of its parts, but the linkages are not made specific or shown how they are interconnected or intersecting with each other. As well, we made a reference to the term holistic nature of life, which denotes really being in touch with all our relationships with each other, with our own bodies, and with all our nature. All of it is reducible, though, to concepts or categories, but is encompassed in everyday life. Or I should say, all of it is not reducible. Now, this is the indigenous example or concept of all my relations as one example of that, which, by the way, to me, as I make this presentation, in a lot of the non-Western based cultures, there's a lot of congruity, ideas and cultural concepts that are congruent to our indigenous concept of all my relations. The second one is reclaiming and learning from the lived experiences of ethnocultural communities on the ground as sources of theological material. Intercultural engagement here imposes what we call an ethical imperative, meaning it chooses to be, so that no one group can claim to have any kind of privileges over other communities. It entails an action of mutual welcoming of all parties, recognizing that all stand on equal ground. So in a sense, intercultural engagement chooses the pathway of what we would call equitable relations. A third one is challenging Western Eurocentric and Euro-Canadian centered forms of knowledge and ways of encountering the divine, which discount other forms of learning along with other forms of knowledge, of doing theology and other forms of living life. What do we mean by this? Just to give a synopsis, a shortened version of that, or an easier way to comprehend. In light with the holistic nature of life that we've spoken earlier, or pointed out earlier, intercultural engagement requires that dominant communities abandon denial, distraction, or deflection of historical grievances, and instead engage in an intentional unlearning of the colonizing mentality and learning decolonizing ways of right relations. And just to add to that, I realize some folks here are hearing the word decolonizing, and rightly so, But I just want to caution us that the decolonizing inquiry for those whose cultural legacy are represented in the colonizing power sector of our society is different from the decolonizing inquiry of the victims of colonialism. And last but not least, the fourth one, how do we do this? By celebrating and valuing of indigenous cultural traditions and knowledges, as well as the celebrating and valuing of the many other ethnocultural, epistemological, and faith traditions that call Canada home. Interculturality requires that cultural diversity becomes a characteristic of the social context. It also requires that different communities become mutually receptive of each other and the different ways they view life, understand God, and interact with each other in ways that are dignifying, just, and life-giving. So as a characteristic, the genuineness of interculturality is demonstrated in the manner that our behavior upholds our relations with each other then. I think as a whole, I hope that this has been helpful to everyone as Lloyd and I try to delineate what we mean by interculturality.
Thank you, Emma. And now we will hear from Kim, who will respond to the two panelists that just spoke.
Thank you to Lloyd and to Emma for bringing some life to the document, to lift it off the page. When I read that document, and I've read it several times because CERN has also, the Canadian Ecumenical Anti-Racism Network, has also had a chance to look at it and to talk about it and to kind of have it seep itself into our being. So when I read it again, I wondered about spiritual knowledge as being named and lifted up. In a way that is also sensory. So I think about the embodiment of Indigenous practices of spirituality that non-Indigenous people will often call cultural. If you've been participating in a smudge or using the medicine wheel or any number of spiritual practices that in Indigenous culture are called spirit and spiritual, and non-Indigenous will call culture. And I started thinking about my own cultures as well and how the culture has been embodied in a knowledge in a way that is often forgotten. So in Japanese, my background is Japanese Canadian. So even hidden in the Asian cultures of practices that seem very mundane, like taking your shoes off at the door. So when I started doing some thinking about, well, that makes sense because it's cleaner, you keep your house clean. But in the Japanese culture, it's also spiritual. It's based in Shinto practice of when you're walking outside, bad spirits and unpleasant and unhealthy things are on your shoes when you're walking. And then when you enter the house, you want to leave that at the door. You don't want to bring those spirits into the house. So it's what's now become cultural practice, which is taking your shoes off when you enter the house, actually had a very spiritual origin. And trying to, it encourages me to reclaim that and to understand what that means for me today when my mother's family was actually Buddhist. But Buddhism and Shintoism in Japanese culture are so deeply intertwined. So when Emma talked about the intersections of interculturality, that is, it's so impossible to separate things out, to say, well, that's culture, and this is where I got this culture, and this is spirit. So it is impossible to do that. There are inseparable intersections of socially constructed and reinforced cultures of things like practice, but also of things like racism and sexism, ableism, ageism, homophobia, and othering of peoples. In comparison to the white majority. So it's also about that there is a racist foundation that needs to be decentered and denormalized and dismantled in order for interculturality to really become real. White superiority and white supremacy culture is a key culture in the Canadian context. And key to the movement of interculturality to unpack. If we're to move from conversation and talking about and even talking with people to becoming that true prophetic community that's mentioned in the document. So I think about the anti-Asian hate and violence that's risen profoundly by the hundreds of percent. In Vancouver, 700% of people who have named being targeted, particularly Asian women. So targeting Asians after the Atlanta shootings has been profoundly increased. It's not as if it just got invented just before the shootings. Anti-Asian hate and discrimination has happened from the moment that Asians arrived on this Turtle Island, particularly in the very British Columbia, a place that was still has the highest anti-Asian sentiments and actions against Asians. 717% was the last percentage I heard about Asians who have lodged complaints and said that they were harassed or attacked since the pandemic started. Anti-Black hostility is another piece that I would lift up that's kind of risen up for me about intersectionality. Anti-Black hostility is just as present in the Asian community as it is in the white community. And anti-Asian sentiment and hostility is present in Black communities, just as it is in white communities. So there are ways that we need to unpack those things and to own them and to do something differently about that. And that comes, that has arisen out of white supremacy because we want to be higher than the other, so that we are not the lowest of the lowest on the othering scale. But it's also despite that. So Asians have different understandings of darkness, which are more economical, which are more class related, that we also need to own. And our communities are beginning to do that in a very intentional way, because we are part of this problem as well. Even though we sometimes can present as white, we are not treated as white. So to me, intercultural is all of those things. We need to not just look at them one at a time, but to say this is all part of the intercultural reality and part of the challenge that we need to face if we're to move ahead, so that it doesn't just become surface culture, but the deep culture that is very intricate to who we are, how we came to be in this country, and how we are connected to our ancestors. I think that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Kim. And now we will hear from Chung, who will respond to the two first panelists, Emma and Lloyd.
And so first thing, my name is Chung Yan, so Joan Yan. So just to put that out there. I had not seen this document until recently, and so a few things for me, and from the conversations and already that has been spoken, I don't want to repeat anything. Something that stood out to me is this document could challenge a lot of the power dynamics in terms of the understanding and practice of hospitality. Sometimes that word gets put out there, we're being hospitable, we're being welcome. How come they're not coming to our church or coming to our faith communities? I think we do need to name that there is still a power dynamics when we talk about hospitality. Who's the host? Whose house is it still? And when you come into somebody's home, it's not yours. You can just throw your jacket somewhere on the seats, or you got to wait till the host tells you where to sit at the table. So if we're going to really be doing this work for intercultural conversations and dialogues, really that space has to come from maybe a teaching from the indigenous communities where no one owns that space. It's a common space. Then therefore it becomes sacred and equal as it is. Another thing I was looking at is the lifting up of lived experience from ethnocultural communities. I wish this document was given to me when I was doing my MDiv, because I had such a tough time trying to figure out, can I be Chinese and Christian at the same time, which led me to write a research paper for my professor, who is a white man, and then I wrote about a mission and power during the 1830s to the 1860s in China. And after I handed in the paper, I got called into the office, which is never a good thing. And then I was told and said, this is a great paper. And I said, that's good. So what's my mark, right? And he said, I want you to go back and write it again. I said, well, what do you mean? You said it was good. This is not your story. Look at your bibliography. Who did you quote? These are all the missionaries. And I said, but these books were in Chinese. They were translated. The stories of the missionary translated into Chinese. And for whatever, socialization, I embraced those as my story. And so when I had to go back and write again, I found a very different experience of the missionaries in the Chinese context. And through that particular exercise, I found the voice of my people, and how profound it is that illustrates that in a really, really true and honest intercultural dialogue and conversation, racialized peoples, everyone around the table needs to do the homework first. You need to answer that question of who you are, where did you come from, and what are those biases there are. I saw another presentation, in the lizard brain, right? The ones that we don't know, that we don't identify, and they come across, and then have that honest conversation. How do you participate in privilege? How do you participate in that system which is barring us from having that heart-to-heart conversation? And I think there is sometimes in this document, it challenges the status quo, what things are if there's nothing wrong, why are we changing? And often the nothing's wrong are the people that are in power having those conversations. And so how do we get those individuals or that particular group to note that they are the gatekeepers of that conversation? Because this document, if they read it, they will agree in principle, but in practice, what does it mean? And I think that homework part, I want to highlight that we do need to each do our homework. It's not just about, those living in, with white privilege need to do the homework. We too need to come with our authentic stories. The last thing is being a true Lutheran. I think this document invites us into a space of confession and forgiveness, that we speak truth to what has happened historically, bring us into a space where it opens up and call each other to see that we do bear the image of God, the image of the Creator in each of us, and the divine that is already in us is just waiting for us to be discovered. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Chun Yan. And what we will do now is each panelist will get an opportunity to either respond, ask any questions of each other, or if they have any additional comments, you will have 1 minute each. You can also pass if there isn't anything that you would like to say at the moment. So we can start with Lloyd.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. Yeah, I would like to highlight just a few things that come from the respondents that I really feel may need to be emphasized. Like when Kim talked about the spiritual and cultural and spirituality being intertwined, that's really very true. And I would like just to lift it up there that is very also common in most of African cultural traditions, where sometimes it's difficult to separate what is culture, what is religion in the African traditional religions, what is spirituality and cultural. And there has been a struggle from African Christianity to really separate that, because they're inseparable. But there's also need to deal with the decolonization of the faith, the decolonization of religion, to demythologize the theology that was taught. So I just thought of highlighting that, and also the anti-Black hostility, somewhat by both the white and sometimes Asian community. It's an experience that has happened, and I observe it now, especially for those of us who are just arriving from the African continent, with what we are terming the new colonialism, which is now emanating mostly from Asia, and in particular the Chinese. new colonization and capturing of land and resources in the African continent. There's a lot of that is happening, and also finding ourselves, as I find that being inspiring when Chung said we also need to find ourselves and do our homework to establish who we are as we get into this conversation, so that we speak as ourselves, we speak as a people. And that's why also this invitation, which is let's come and engage from diverse groups and diverse, trying to include everyone.
Thank you, Lloyd. And we will now move on to Emma. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I want to go back to the very last point that I had addressed. It's about our Canadian context. In our Canadian context, I really think we need to intentionally learn first about our Indigenous cultural traditions. And when I say that, our Indigenous cultural traditions, those will be the ones, the Indigenous peoples here in Canada. My sense when we talk about interculturalism or interculturality, when we lump the significance of the history of our Indigenous peoples in this country, then we lose out on what we can learn from that. And what, as I think it was mentioned before, that's a sacred space of commonality. Actually, nobody owns the land, but then they still welcome us. And I think there's where then I move on to what our other panelists have mentioned about power. What do we do with power? I think power there is already being demonstrated to us, how to use it and how to, in relation with others. In the general Western perspective of duality and separation and all that, and guided by modernity, I think we lose out if we don't return back we don't go to the indigenous paradigm that we have in this country. And so I think it's important that we at least start there as we move on and learn more. How then do we piece out this whole idea and meaning of interculturality as we live it out as well? I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks, Guillermo.
Thank you, Emo. And we will move on to Kim now.
Thank you. So when I introduced myself, I introduced my Japanese name, which is Harumi. Because I was born on my father's birthday, I have my father's feminization of my father's name. And there was a time, most of my life, I would never say my Japanese name, never, because it was like ridicule or where did that name come from? That's a weird name. So I never used to name that. Even on my forms, I never put it down. But in claiming my own culture and my own indigeneity and my own identity, it is actually a gift to me that my father gave me, and in a sense, my spirit name. So when I began working with Indigenous congregations and Indigenous communities, I was able to introduce myself by my spirit name, which they understood, like, yes, you have a spirit name. We are related. And that helped me to understand the relations that we all have if we become true to who we actually are. And who we have been raised to be in a way that has been oppressed and repressed by the white dominant culture. So we talk about power. The fact that my name was basically silenced for decades was part of that power as well. And I feel like now I have enough of a community support that I'm reclaiming that power of naming myself. I also wanted to thank you, Lloyd, for talking about body, because body and sensory and senses and connected with spirit have been really looked down upon in the white Western cultures and Christianity, particularly. Body is bad, senses are bad. You need to just think with your head and sit quietly and still and just listen and take things in, as opposed to having your body respond to what you're hearing, having your body respond to the different cultures. My first encounter with a congregation from Congo was to actually move, because I feel like I've been born to be a mover, and so that language of body spoke to me too and responded to my body as well. So a lot of our indigenous cultures have something you can smell, something you can taste. And so when I smell Japanese incense, I immediately can feel my whole body responding and not just my nose or my head. That there's something that we need to embrace in our cultural wholeness. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And we can move on to Chun Yang right now.
So I have a similar experience with my name, and partly the reclaiming of that has only happened last year because I didn't want to make other people's lives difficult by making them learn my name. And my name comes from the book of John, chapter 1, verse 16. My sister and I, together, we make up grace upon grace. And it's a faith name and a spirit name, as Kim is mentioning, and it honors the hopes and dreams that my parents had for me in their faith. So the name Joanne means nothing other than an immigration officer thought that it sounded like that. And so, but that may be part of the decolonizing work that I have to do for myself, to think that I am good enough to use my own name. I wanted to add about the body part. I wish there will be a time where, speak for my own tradition here, the Lutherans would no longer think Lutherans are German. Would no longer think of, when we were talking about the 500th anniversary, back in 2017, and I was planning the service, and the thing that was highlighted was we need German, Scandinavian, and I said, where are all the Lutherans now? Not populated in those places, Latin America and Africa, so we should be singing music from different places. But the comments are, well, that's not really music. I said, to your ears, right? There are lots of engagement within that, and the whole young churches, right? We know better. There has to be some way of dismantling that our insights and our experience of God is no less than the ones that are more Eurocentric. And just because they wrote the book doesn't mean that is the only truth. And I think that's the work is for us to do as racialized communities, but as also, if they keep sitting in those chairs, we won't get to be around the table. So there needs to be some coaxing to get out of the chairs so that there is space. It works really well in Chinese restaurants because it's a round one. You just get your chair and just shove yourself in there, right? But at the same time, there is dismantling that needs to be done.
And thank you, Chun Yang. So now what we will do is the participants are able to put in the chat a question for one of the panelists. So you can either put their name down, and if there is no name, then we can assume that any one of the panelists can answer. If you can start with that. In the meantime, if any one of the panelists would like to say anything in addition to what you've already said, you have a few minutes because you all have behaved very well and have actually kept the time and even have less time. So you can have any additional comments right now. And like I said, the participants can go ahead and ask the questions to any one of the panelists. And we will be hearing from Nestor at the end of the program.
I think so much of what the intercultural movement is about sharing our stories, sitting at the table and sharing our lives, and sharing food with one another, but not just sharing food with one another, but sharing the way that we share food is an important part of our cultures as well. That I remember, because Japanese tend to have their individualized dishes, and whereas Chinese food is like anybody digs in, and there's something about going back and forth between both. Sometimes you just want your own thing, especially if you have special diets, but other times you just want to be part of the big pot and just dip your chopsticks in there with everybody else. And so the Japanese culture was to turn your chopsticks around so that you don't take food out of the bowl that you're eating with. So people, when I first did that, people look at me and go, "What are you doing?" But that's a cultural practice, and it had health reasons as well. So keep the main pot clean and just eat from the other end. So, but you don't realize that until you're with another group who says, oh, that's different. Why do you do that? And you have to think about it. Well, why do we do that? So I think food is a good place, but don't just end there.
If I can add to this, I would like to encourage us when in this framing around what interculturality is, we need to name names. Paulo Freire says, name your enemy. Okay, forget about the enemy, but let's name it. Please don't call me Asian. Learn who I am, my identity. Learn Kim's, who is she? But she's not just Japanese, as you heard, her mother is Buddhist, and she also has a Shinto. We're talking about Asian violence. Well, what's that Asian violence? When the one that suffered at Atlanta came from one dominant group, and that would be a Chinese descent women. Let's name names, and rather than just say lump us into one label. And the same thing for the rest of us. I have friends who are coming from Africa. I said, well, don't call me African, because I came from a certain country, and I just didn't come from a certain country. I came from a certain heritage, people group that I'm proud of. So learn those things rather than just lump it, be lazy. And interculturality is telling us not to be lazy. Engage, engage, engage.
And I think building on that too is that our kids are Indonesian and Chinese. So interculturality is necessary because we have to give space for our children to figure out who they are. And once I heard the kids, I never taught them because I would have told them they're maybe half and half or something like that. But somebody asked them, aren't you Indonesian or aren't you Chinese? So they said, I'm 100% Chinese and 100% Indonesian. I try to correct their math, but they said that I don't need to choose, and I want the fullness of both experience, and I'm not rejecting either, and that adds to that. And I think when we move into a space where we need to deal with the generations that have that intersectionality much more complex wise, not only interculturally, but interchurch, unions and interfaith unions. How do we be open enough to speak on the value of all contributing to the life of that particular family and community? It only can get richer. It's not going to be less, right?
Okay, so now we have some questions. So we will look at what the participants are asking. And the first comes from Tina. How do you distinguish cultic practice from intercultural respect? And there's no name, so anyone can answer.
Just for clarity, I assume when they say cultic practice, that we're dealing with individuals here who become idols in a cultural setting. Am I correct? I'm not clear. If you can get some clarity on that.
Tina, you can probably speak to that. Just unmute yourself.
There are some practices that we see that is common in some churches or some faith communities. And you wonder, and you sometimes look around and just say, oh, this is what you do in this church. And sometimes you wonder, is that just a cultic practice or something that was developed out of their own cultural identity?
To me, respect is an important part of that question. Is it respectful? Does it respect the people? Does it respect the community rather than an individual? Some cults tend to focus on one individual as being the charismatic center of that cult. And interculturality at its truest form would be about the community, about being the good of the community, about lifting up the unheard voices. unrecognized peoples, honored peoples. And so that, to me, that's the difference. Is it about one person and their little cult and their center of attention, or is it about the mutuality of the whole community? That often will continue to expand and to include others into that as well. That, to me, that's how I would read that question.
Also, if I read another way into the question, is that let's say this community wants to be intercultural, and then so they take something from Japan, take something from China, take something from Philippines. So there's a very sensitive line between tourism, just to make me feel good. Look how diverse I am. To the story and context, which much like what Amos said, to know the person and then bring that about. So if you're going to pray for Palestine and use a chant from Palestine, tell the story of the person that wrote it, give credit to the people that created that music and that liturgy, and isn't I do it so that I'm now intercultural, checkbox, right? It is a transformative experience that changes who we are and how we are in the world. So I think I want to just kind of add a note in there about the feel-good factor and what really is happening.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the next question by Robert. In a theology of culture, is there a redemptive aspect where every culture's needs to be redeemed and transformed to the image of Christ?
Very quickly, can I just address that? That assumes that there's one culture that's above everybody else, everything else. How do we know it's redempted? It's redeemed, I should say. And so I would probably say, check that out. That's a very white-centered question in terms of the framing of that does not help us to get into the intercultural framework. When I say white-centered, please don't take this personally. I'm just talking about within the society that we're in. A lot is white-centered, and even some questions that we put out in assumptions to the questions, like redemption, could be white-centered. And so this is a good example how then we need to engage back into interculturality and use the guiding principles that we've put up, at least put it in a document form, that we can use it to learn how to reframe questions that would be intercultural in its essence.
Maybe to try and also respond to that question. I think this is a question that we have struggled with in the development of Christianity in Africa, where certain aspects of European culture or Western culture was defined as Christianity came kind of enveloped in a Western traditional culture. And the question we grappled with, or we are still grappling with as Africans, developing what we would call African Christianity or Christianity in Africa, is to say, what is Christianity? What is the gospel? What is Christianity and what is Western? And can we envelope the faith from the culture, and then also see in our culture what is it that is in the African cultures. I mean, you cannot talk of African culture in the African cultures that works together with Christianity. That is still so. There is need to really define what is faith. When you ask that question, we need to define what is it that we are calling Christianity that is not enveloped in some culture, which is a different debate, which is a difficult debate, because I am who I am, and then the faith comes into me as a person, and then I have to express it in this way. So there has been a lot of European Christianity that has been labeling everything that the missionaries did not understand. Then they labeled it cultic, fetishism, demonic, and all that. And anything that they did not understand. So I think that debate comes in there into this question. it's quite some debate that needs to happen there to see, is there something we would really call, this is the faith, this is Christianity, that we don't get enveloped in culture.
Robert
As the
Cousins.
whole Old Testament is enveloped in the Jewish culture.
Robert Cousins here. Emma and I go way back, so we know.
No, don't date me.
Yeah, but I think you're making a big assumption, Emma here. Just let me very briefly say, I work up at Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center, so don't stereotype me because of that. But when I talk about a theology of culture, I'm talking about every culture can be affirmed because we are made in the image of God. Secondly, every culture is relativized. There is no absolute one culture better than another. And so I include in that the fact that I'm Irish Canadian. I am no better than anyone who is not Irish Canadian. But the third dimension is, relativizing of culture does not mean that cultures cannot be critiqued. And I mean, from us, from the evangelical side of things, we try to ask the question, does Scripture judge all cultures, beginning with my own? And I know this is delicate because Scripture itself is embedded in culture. And so we have to discern, the cultural aspects when we interpret Scripture. But, so that's where I'm coming from. Not that all cultures are relativized to the point where we're not able to say as the people of God that Scripture has something to say in the affirming, in the relativizing, and also in the challenging and redemptive aspects for every culture. I think it was Leslie Newbingham, and I'll stop here. Leslie Newbingham, who said, the church, the global church, is the hermeneutic of the gospel. And I take by that, it means that when the global church comes together and reflects and struggles with what Scripture is saying, they will have a much better understanding of how Scripture applies to culture.
Okay, thank you, Robert. We have to move on to the next question now, but thank you for your comment.
Carmen, I would like to respond just briefly to that, to Robert's comments. I would say that in the history of a theology of culture, it's been the white dominant culture that has held the theology. And so any culture obviously needs to look into its own needs for redemption, and it's up to those cultures to do that. So what has often happened is that the white culture has taken over and says, well, you people need to redeem yourselves, and we'll tell you how to do it. So what the intercultural paper is saying is that do your own work. White cultures need to do their own work. Asian cultures, Japanese cultures, Filipino cultures, Chinese cultures, we're doing our own work, and various African cultures, Zimbabwean culture, Zairean cultures, Jamaican cultures are all doing their own work. And so that's where the story is not full and complete. And sometimes there just needs to be a pause to let the people who are doing their work to just do their work.
I agree with you, but living in a multicultural context like Toronto, where you're part of an intercultural church, there has to be some form of intercultural exchange without judging the other person's culture. Thank you very much. I agree with you, Kim. Thank you.
And I would say that is happening as being someone who works in the region with congregations that consider themselves intercultural. There are a huge range of intercultural iterations, some of which are multicultural, some of which are what seems to be culturally specific. And in fact, when you get to know them, as Emma says, get to know them, they are already intercultural. So that's the bigger picture, that the more we have conversation, the more we can put our pieces into that big picture.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to Vince's question now. Thank you for all the comments. What do you say to the Indigenous people who say that interculturality is another form of interculturation and assimilation?
So the first time that I heard that was, well, I was told the word intercultural ministries while I was still studying Emmanuel College. And I think that was at the early stages of trying to define that term. And the vision of that, though it probably isn't the same as now, was that the ethnic churches needs to integrate into the mainline churches. Okay, that was said to me, and I heard the integrate word, and I didn't go well with me. I was at that point still participating in the Ethnic Ministries Council within the United Church, and so I didn't quite get what that was. But then there was nothing else further said because it was still at the early stages of that. I think we've moved on from that, and so interculture culture can, just like the last question, can be read and heard differently the way that it was proposed. And from a position where we haven't been heard, we've been silenced and marginalized, we hear things with a thinner skin. Okay, let's be honest. And so my first reaction to the last question was, I don't need to be redeemed. My culture is just fine, right? So, but and so I think the reaction, we don't need to. My position, I don't think we need to say anything to the Indigenous peoples because their experience is valid, and we need to hear that and say, what is it that we're doing, and that is causing that reaction. And I think there's in other things too, we need to realize Indigenous communities do not function and work the same way as maybe the majority of the world. And we need to figure out how do we work together. Go ahead, Emil.
Thank you. I have to say, Zong Yun. Am I correct in pronouncing the name? Apologies. I'm trying
It's
learning.
good. It's good.
Okay. I actually had this conversation with Indigenous folks and a couple of Indigenous elders. And I have to listen to them very carefully because what they're really telling me, listen, before all these terms, interculturality came to us, we were already living it. So don't tell me the term. That, to me, I just shut up and say, I get it. And so I don't use the term in front of them because it's really for us now who are reusing the term. We cannot impose the term to them because the moment we impose that term to them, we are now colonizing them. We're entering that space again, which is very traumatic to them. And so to them, yeah, I mean, I listened earlier when Kim was saying in her engagement with Indigenous folks, speak your truth and stop converting. I mean, in this sense, in the framework of interculturality. And so that, to me, I think is where we need to learn. And that's why I think it's important that from the very beginning, when we talk about engaging interculturality, we need to learn quite a bit from our Indigenous siblings in this country.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, if then intercultural, if we are taking it as a prescription of how to come together, then it will have a problem. But I think if we are prepared to listen, when we talk about intercultural as listening space, where all individuals or cultures or groups define themselves. But if it is a prescription or a template, I think it will have problems, because as long as there is a group that is defining intercultural and say, this is what will be intercultural, then that group that is defined, it means it is defining intercultural according to what they would tolerate from other cultures. But if we approach intercultural with a listening that we are getting at this, in this conversation, we are engaging in this conversation where we are going to listen and let each culture define itself and let each culture express itself, then we can have that interculturality. But if there is a template and if there is a sense of propagating what intercultural is, then it means who is that person who is defining and say, this is what intercultural is, so you come and fit into this frame. Then that brings a challenge. But if our intercultural is come, tell us who you are and how we can move together, how we can work together, and listen to each person, to each group, how they express themselves. I think that's it will be different. But if it is, there's a template, then it's enculturation, then it's assimilation, because it's already defined and there's already a template and there's propagation.
Thank you, and our time is up for this section. We will now be going into breakout rooms, and there will be a brief time for a report back from each of the groups, either verbally or in the chat. We'll see depending on how much time we have. And so please name someone who might report back and record that. And also here are the questions. So you're going to be reflecting on how does your cultural background and spirituality inform your understanding of interculturality? And what can I name from the document and presentations that engages my understanding of interculturality? And please, everyone should have a turn to say something in the group. And Jonathan, can you let us know how much time each group has?
Yeah, I think let's say about 15 minutes, and there'll be a countdown, so you'll be able to see that in your room. I also want to remind you that when you go into your room, to make sure you turn your video on and unmute yourself. Yeah, so there'll be a countdown. We'll send the questions into the rooms as well as a message, and we'll give you a warning when you're getting near the end of the time. But you're looking at about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So you're going to get an invitation to the room, and actually it might be good. Say one more time the questions. That might not hurt.
Okay. In the meantime, how does your cultural background and spirituality inform your understanding of interculturality? And what can I name from the document and presentations that engages my understanding of interculturality? Welcome back, everyone. So this is what we will do. There's 5 groups, so each group will have already picked someone to report back. So you'll be given the opportunity to speak and just unmute yourself and just speak briefly on one insight, and then the rest can go into the chat. So someone from group 1. Can start. Just unmute yourself, the person who was chosen to report back.
They might not know their group numbers, so they just any group at it can go.
Okay.
From a Quaker point of view, I became a Quaker after getting booted out of the United Church, more or less, or booting myself out of the United Church. I became a Quaker because everybody in a Quaker meeting is a minister. We're all equal. And so we started thinking of ourselves as a community of equals. But I didn't expect, and as soon as I became a Quaker, I would be asked to go to the Don jail and meet all the inmates, and they became my ministers. It's the most multicultural experience I've ever had in my life. And those guys were not taking anything from me that they can hand back. So it's a life-changing experience.
Thank you, Keith. The next group.
Well, we were group number 2, Karen, and I think a couple of the things that we talked about, the naming really hit a piece of that, and reclaiming name and having people learn how to say names. And even if it puts them in a space where they're not comfortable, it brings some of that. And that a posture of learning, of taking time to learn from each other, and recognizing that sometimes if we grow up in a monoculture, it might be different than others, but that we need some of those come back to how we walk together, and each culture carries the gospel in itself, and how do we engage with that? Those were a couple of things that came out of our group.
Thank you, Karen. The next group.
Nestor, you were just about to sum up 2 points from our group. Could you do us the honor, and do you remember them?
Not really, but what I wanted to say is that in our group, we did mention that that we were understanding interculturality as a space of listening, and so that regardless of where we are from, this is an opportunity for us to just sit there and hear out what another is saying. And the other aspect of it was just to think about how it is that we all experience religious aspects, but that in some way those have already been transformed within culture, because that's how we inherit them. And that, so we don't receive them as this is cultural and this is religious. We just receive them as a one package deal in our socialization. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Nestor.
To group
The
5?
next group.
Okay. There were quite a few points, but I think 2 that kind of came together for us. I would say that it was expressed by one person is that his learning was that practicing his spirituality comes in decolonizing actions that he could take, as opposed to once seeing himself as not having a culture, coming from a Southern Ontario white background. And then secondly, I think the comment was every location has work of dismantling to do. And so it's sharing that, understanding what those works will be.
Thank you. I believe there's one more group. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Someone in our group said that we must begin by addressing the injustice to the Indigenous people. Somebody else said there's more talk than the walk in terms of interculturality, and that we have to confess that there's much that we're not listening to and we're not aware of or see, and then begin to do what we can to change ourselves so that we address deal with others with more grace and inclusivity.
Okay, thank you. And there hasn't been very many comments in the chat, but I'll read a comment from Tina. The act of reading scripture is in itself an intercultural act, as we read from the culture that shaped and created these writings. And if there's any more comments that you would want to add in the chat, you're welcome to do that now. And if there's anything that the panelists would like to say at this time, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
I was going to say, we went first. So one of the things that didn't really get said was, well, one of my comments, which I made sure I got everybody else's in, is I really appreciated Emo saying the idea that in Canada that we need to look and take with our Indigenous peoples, but once again, that we would actually acknowledge that those Indigenous populations are very varied, and from the Nihawak to the Mohawk to the Niska to the Mi'kmaq to the Inuit and the Métis across our land, that we would take time to know them, each one, wherever we're at, and because they are incredibly different and diverse, and they don't all do it the same.
Thank you, Karen. And I'll just read a couple more comments and then we will move on unless that someone has any additional. Oh, sorry, Lloyd, did you put up your hand? Okay. Comment, we agreed that it is complicated if it is to be done right. And then Barbara said, I have also used different translations as a way of understanding different ways of understanding scripture. And we will now move on to the final remarks from Nestor. And you have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you. To be honest, this is a very complicated thing to do because there has been so many ideas and so much to say. But one of the first things that I want to mention is that at the end of the day, to talk about interculturality is to talk about people. It's how we work hard towards dignifying the people of the world, their traditions, particularly those that are present within our social context. So in many ways, interculturality is about making those people that have usually been silent, present in the Canadian landscape. But of course, you're gonna get tired if I begin to tell you a whole lot of things. So I just thought that I'd give you 5 points, just as takeaways of what I kind of managed to capture of all the conversation. But I feel like I need to do a qualification, you know, when the television comes out, you know, the proceeding does not represent the ideas or the comments of the presenter. So I feel like I need to say that because I don't want to in any way misrepresent the interaction and the conversation, but here he goes. I hope he does manage to capture things. The first point that I want to make is that interculturality is means an approach to history that is no longer sanitized. And that is to say that manages to engage colonization today, but also as it has taken place historically. The important is to recognize that colonization and the depriving of cultural and religious traditions and spiritualities from racialized and minoritized groups was the norm of the missionary movement in its inability to recognize indigenous communities, their traditions, their cultures, and their knowledges as central places where the divine was already at work. So, as many have said, the interculturality is therefore a very personal experience, but also a very personal activity in which one reclaims one's own indigeneity. Another way to say it would be to say, what are the kernels of wisdom that have gotten buried as a result of colonization, and particularly within Christianity, or that Christianity has not uncovered by virtue of being Eurocentric? So that's point 1. As you can see, those are small points. Number 2, I want to also mention to you that interculturality is not a superficial tokenistic inclusion of people from other cultural groups. What we have been hearing is that interculturality means to engage the uncomfortable and sometimes risky business of creating spaces for all those who are racialized and minoritized. And that is a very important aspect, particularly because those communities have been silenced within mainstream theological conversations, including in conversations about the gospel. So I was really happy that the gospel conversation just came out. So that's point number 2. Point number 3. Interculturality then is an invitation for those in the dominant tradition to learn from and allow themselves to be interrogated, interpolated by racialized and minoritized peoples. It is about having their social privileges and power be challenged as the resulting effect of colonization. So one of the issues of interculturality is that it seeks to destabilize present structures of power within and without the church. Saying it more bluntly, it is time that we, racialized and minoritized peoples, are heard, and that the dominant or the members of the dominant culture listen, not speak. Anyway, that's number 3. Number 4. Interculturality then is about interrogating social structures and ecclesial structures as designed to privilege Euro-Canadian and Euro-North Atlantic intellectual and theological traditions and expressions of leadership. In its most direct way, it means that racialized and minoritized peoples must play a central role at the highest levels of leadership. Let me say it differently. A church that is not intercultural is truncated and incomplete, because not a single theology nor a single cultural group has a corner in determining what it means to be intercultural, but also much less has a corner in determining how the divine is or is not at work in other cultural groups. And my 5th point, which is what I managed to gather, interculturality crosses boundaries, establishes new spaces of engagement for thinking, theology, and faith, the human, and the activity of the divine. It is a holistic approach that accounts for all of life and highlights the reality that people's cultural traditions impact, inform, and shape their experiences of faith. Anyway, I'm sure that you're probably gonna get bored, but before you get bored, let me just say this. We started with this. Interculturality is a framework as we're proposing it in this document and an invitation for conversation. It is a framework insofar as some aspects that I have mentioned are guiding principles in determining the success or the failure of interculturality within our communities. But it is also a conversation, a time of listening, and a time of sharing, embodied by hugs, by being able to touch each other, by food, by music, by liturgy. Because it means that there is no single place that determines what interculturality will look like in different places. Or let me say it differently. Interculturality is heavily shaped by the social, cultural, ethno-racial, and socio-political context within which different cultural groups engage each other. Of particular attention is that the contextual nature of interculturality also relates to how different church communities will think through and incorporate the presence of different cultural traditions. So there is no formula. Isn't that amazing? There is no single way in which interculturality can be. But as we think interculturality, perhaps it will be useful to think that we are building a prophetic community. A prophetic community as a challenge to our communities. Let me say it differently. I like to say things differently, as you can see. What would it mean to defy the structures of racialization and discrimination? The structures that undermine other people and all they signify along their lines of gender, race, color, religious traditions, sexual orientation, and ability. In other words, we're called to dismantle those social markers which have done so much damage to so many people, but which also have been so distinctly connected to our Christian faith. So we need to fight, we need to struggle, And we can only do that together in conversation. Anyway, that's all I have. Sorry.
Thank you, Nestor. There was a question for you. If this could become available, your 5 points. You're also, this is recorded as well so that you can view it once again. But if you could answer that.
Sure.
Nestor? Yeah, okay. So.
I'll be happy to send them to Jonathan, and he can distribute it to the people because he has the contact information of everybody.
Okay, thank you. So any last pressing questions before we close this session? You can put them in the chat, or if there's anything else that the panelists would like to say before we close.
Nestor, that was an excellent summary. So thank you for those points and the elaboration of those points. It really helps to bring things into focus and to make it more important, which is, I think, what needs to happen in our churches, that we need to understand. People often say, well, what is interculturalism? How do we get there? And it's a journey that we're not going to be there, and we can't do it by ourselves. So we need to do it together.
Yes, yes.
I wonder, Carmen, if I might jump in at this point and just say a word of gratitude. Carmen's going to thank the panelists and so on, but this was beautiful tonight or this afternoon. And I also want to, part of the beauty is the people that were here together. And thank you for giving 2 hours of your time to this important work. We're going to move forward with this work. There's a study guide in process that we'll be sharing so others can engage this document. I think the other thing that was mentioned early on, this is a living document and we expect it will change. This is not, just as was just said, this is not the recipe book for interculturality. This is the work that we're all doing together. I guess, and I also want to acknowledge, part of the beauty of this group that's here is that they're from all around the world. Like literally, we have people from Australia and New Zealand and the US, and there were a couple, I think there was someone from the Philippines. I didn't catch all of the places that people are actually signing in. And I want to note that all of those places are lands that have been occupied and lived on and have been part of the lives of people for generation after generation. So we want to acknowledge that the land that we meet on is the lands of many different people, and that those peoples and that land has shaped this conversation today and continues to shape our conversations and is an important part of this work of interculturality. So again, thank you all. Carmen.
So we want to give special thanks to Emma, to Lloyd, Kim, Chunyan, and Nestor. And just to let you know, this is the second in a series of 4 webinars offered by Phil this spring. And the next webinar is May 26th, and it is called The Canadian Churches, Poverty and Intercultural Analysis. And you can register for future webinars and view the recordings of past webinars at interculturalleadership.ca. We're offering these webinars for free, and they are accessible to as many people through the support of individuals. If you are able, please consider a donation, and you can also donate through our website. And after the webinar, we will be sending instructions on how to donate if you need it. And again, thank you all for participating in this webinar today, and I've had a lot of fun today. Thank you for the great conversation.